Welcome everyone to today's Osterman Research webinar, another in a series of regular informational webinars hosted by Osterman Research and sponsored by KnowBe4. KnowBe4 offers the world's most popular integrated new school security awareness training and simulated phishing platform to over 9,000 customers. Our speakers today are Michael Osterman and Eric Krohn. Michael is the founder and principal of Osterman Research and will introduce Osterman Research momentarily. Eric is a security awareness advocate at KnowBe4. He's a security veteran with over 20 years experience in the medical, aerospace, manufacturing, and defense fields. Now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Michael to get started. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, Bob, thank you very much for that nice introduction, and I'd like to thank everybody who's here on the call with us today. In the next 55 minutes or so, we're going to share some information about the threats that your organizations are facing from ransomware and spearphishing and business email compromise and so forth, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. And we do want to encourage you to ask your questions in the chat box you see on your screen, and also we'll be announcing the winners of the 3 $100 Amazon.com gift certificates at the end of the webinar. So a little bit, let me keep this going here, a little bit about Osterman Research so you understand our perspective in all this. We're an independent market research and consulting firm, and our focus really is on messaging, web, and collaboration. So we focus on the way that people communicate or collaborate in a workplace context. And so we're very focused on security, things like spearphishing and BEC and ransomware and just all the other types of threats that organizations face. But we also look at things like archiving, how organizations preserve their content, encryption, and so forth. We have a very strong emphasis on primary research that we conduct on a continual basis with both influencers and decision makers, typically in mid-sized and large organizations. The company's about 16 years old, and we're based near Seattle. And unfortunately, Seattle looks nothing like you see in the picture there today. It's gray and overcast. This is pretty typical. So some statistics on the current state of cybercrime. We all know that cybercrime is bad. We spend a lot of money on security infrastructure. We encounter phishing emails. A lot of us have been hacked or have had malware infiltrations and so forth. And these are just some various stats that we've collected from secondary sources. Last year, for example, the World Economic Forum placed the global cost of cybercrime at almost $450 billion. Now that's in things like losses from ransomware or data breaches, theft, and so forth. The Ponybon Institute estimates that a typical 10,000 employee company is going to spend $3.7 million per attack just dealing with a simple phishing attack. They'd Secure estimated that the cost of a single spearphishing attack against a company with $100 million in revenue that loses 50,000 records is going to be $7.2 million. The FBI estimated that for the 2 years ended June of last year, CEO fraud or business email compromise attacks have cost more than 22,000 businesses that have fallen victim to it, a total of a little over $3 billion. And the last stat here, ransomware attacks have netted cyber criminals about $1 billion just in 2016. So the problem is bad. We know how bad it is based on these stats. But if you are the victim of ransomware, if you're the victim of a data breach, a hack, these costs can be just astronomical from your perspective. There can be just enormous costs, enormous implications on not only the direct remediation, but also in the aftermath, the lost revenue, the loss of reputation, having to deal with the press or dealing with irate customers. I mean, these are very serious problems, and if you've been hit with one of them, you know just how serious they are. And this came from a survey that we did earlier this year. And what we asked was, what kinds of things have happened? And so we gave respondents a laundry list of different types of attacks or breaches. And these are mid-sized and large organizations, primarily in North America. We found that more than a third of organizations had an email phishing attack successfully infect their network with malware. About the same proportion experienced malware infiltration through an unknown source. About a third experienced some sort of a CEO fraud or BEC attack, actually penetrate their defenses, but thankfully not trick anyone. However, look down the list here, and we have had about 15% of organizations experienced some sort of a BEC attack that actually did successfully trick executives into wiring money away or sending off things like W-2 forms and so forth. And I won't go through all of these, but the bottom line here is that only 1 in 6 of the organizations that we surveyed did not experience any sort of infection or breach. And this is really very serious because we're looking at hundreds of thousands of companies across North America and millions across the world, and we're finding that the vast majority during the last 12 months have had some sort of successful attack against them, whether it was malware infiltration or hacking or some sort of a data breach or a BEC attack, whatever the case is. Most organizations are under attack, and the bad guys have been successful in most cases in doing something. And particularly concerning here is this second bullet, that 35% of organizations have experienced malware infiltration through an unknown source. That's probably the worst kind of attack because you have no idea where it came from. Did it come from something that you did from a user clicking on a phishing email? Did it come in through some sort of a software vulnerability? That's a very serious issue that organizations are having to deal with on a regular basis. And what we also found is that problems are getting worse. For a lot of organizations, their key security problems really are getting worse over time. For example, with regard to phishing and spearphishing, we found that 15% of organizations told us that their problems are actually getting worse over time. Despite the millions that organizations have spent in dealing with these problems, they're not getting any better for a fairly significant proportion. 13% have reported that their ransomware problems are getting worse. 8% have reported that their BEC problems are getting worse over time. And the good news here is that for a lot of companies, the problems are actually getting better. For a lot, though, they're getting worse. And for a fairly significant proportion, there's been no change. So despite the millions that a typical company will spend on security, the problems really just are not getting any better. So, one of the fundamental issues here is that cyber criminals are getting better over time. And this picture of Al Capone here, he was very successful, obviously, in committing lots of different types of crime, just like cyber criminals are today. These are typically criminal organizations, very often in Russia or Eastern Europe. They tend to be very well funded because their efforts are very successful. As shown on the previous slide, 5 out of 6 organizations that we surveyed have been the victim of some sort of a cyber attack. And so these attacks are very well funded. Organizations are able to fund new research and so forth on new ways to penetrate organizations. The attacks are increasingly sophisticated. We're seeing much more in the way of BEC attacks or business email compromise attacks where specific individuals within a company will be targeted. Also, cyber criminals are becoming better at covering their tracks. Really good hackers will be able to launch an attack and make it very difficult to find out who it was that attacked the organization. Dwell time is key to many attacks, particularly for BEC attacks. Dwell time, if you're not familiar with it, is the amount of time that a criminal can get into a network and basically poke around and look around for things. So, for example, Mandiant has published statistics over the last several years showing that dwell time is on the order of 120 to 140 days, depending upon their particular survey that they've done. And what that allows a criminal to do is get into a network and start looking at the business processes that an organization undertakes on a regular basis. They can see the wire transfers that take place, the amounts, the suppliers, all of these things that are critical to the operation of a business. And then they can decide to launch a BEC attack. And when they send the CFO or the COO or somebody who has decision-making authority in wire transfers, they send them a message, they can craft a message that's going to be very believable, it's going to fit in with the normal business process, and it's going to be in an amount and to a supplier that simply makes sense. And so a lot of CEOs or CFOs or COOs will simply be tricked because the message that they're receiving fits right into the flow of what they normally do as part of their work. And a big part of that is the dwell time that allows attackers to get in and really study their targets quite carefully. So a few examples here, and I won't go through all these, but the top one here, the GoldenEye ransomware, is currently targeting German speakers in human resources departments using a two-part attack. The first part is an attachment with a PDF file delivered in an email that contains a cover letter, and the second attachment is an Excel spreadsheet that uses malicious macros that will then load ransomware by asking the victim to click a link. And as we'll see in just a moment here, victims are really very likely and will very frequently click these links or open these attachments, despite the fact that they probably know they shouldn't. The bottom bullet here, there have been a lot of victims of CEO fraud or business email compromise over the last several years, including Kralin Bank in Belgium, FACC, Mattel, the Schuler Company, and so forth. So there have been a lot of organizations that have been attacked with BEC and lost, literally, as you can see here, tens of millions of dollars in a very short period of time. So this is a very serious issue that not only impacts large organizations, but it can also impact smaller ones, school districts, churches, smaller companies, and so forth, that may not have good security awareness training for their employees. They may not have good security infrastructure to detect all of this and so forth. So these are very serious issues, and what we're looking at here is really just the tip of the iceberg. Part of the problem is that a lot of users are just not really very careful when they're dealing with email, when they're working with social media, and so forth. For example, in the 2016 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, they found that the median time between the launch of an email phishing campaign and the first opening of an email is 1 minute and 40 seconds. So the bad guy launches an email phishing campaign, and less than 2 minutes later, they've hit their first target. The median time to the first click on an attachment is only 225 seconds. So we're dealing with a very successful threat vector that a cyber criminal can use and be almost guaranteed to hit its target within literally just a few minutes. Also, 30% of the phishing messages that Verizon studied were actually opened. So a recipient received a phishing message and they opened it. It was only 23% in their report a year earlier. Also, 12% of users clicked on the phishing attachment or link. That's 1 out of 8 users that gets a phishing attack or maybe a spearphishing attack, and then they open the attachment or they click on the link. They know they shouldn't, or they should be taught not to do that, but a very significant proportion of them do that. And this is really one of the key threat vectors. It's the lack of skepticism on the part of users. It's the part of the lack of care, and fundamentally the lack of training about what organizations and what individual users should do with the content that they're receiving. And part of the problem is that most users are really just not very well trained. They don't have good security awareness training. The organization has not taken the time or spent the resources to train users on what to do with suspicious emails. Now, we asked organizations in a recent survey about different types of security awareness training, the human firewall approach, or just doing a monthly security video, or doing phishing tests, or the break room approach. And what we found is that a lot of organizations don't do any of these. We found, for example, with regard to the human firewall approach, over half of organizations absolutely never do it. Over half of organizations, and apologize for the typo there, over half of organizations never do even a monthly security video to try to make users more aware of phishing and spear phishing and related types of attacks. About 2 out of 5 organizations never do any sort of phishing tests on their users. And about a third never do any sort of break room approach, where they'll have people come in and just have an informal session on security awareness training, new phishing techniques, things of this nature. So it's absolutely essential that organizations train their users on how to deal with phishing and spear phishing and so forth, but a significant proportion, in some cases over half, absolutely never do it, and they should be doing it. Part of the problem that leads to is that IT confidence in users tends to be pretty low. IT decision makers' confidence in their security defenses, today is fairly modest. Anywhere from 34 to 56% believe their systems are good or excellent in their effectiveness in dealing with key threats. So that's the gateways, the cloud security, the server-based security, the endpoint security, and so forth. The confidence in those systems is fairly low. but it's even lower in terms of users. Only 30 to 41% of IT decision makers expressed the level of confidence that is good or excellent in terms of their end user training. So the fundamental problem here is not only the security infrastructure that's lacking, being able to eliminate malware before it gets to end users or eliminating ransomware attempts and so forth, but it's even lower in terms of the end users, training senior executives on detecting BEC or training end users on detecting and addressing phishing threats, like not clicking on links or not opening attachments. So the problem here is that users are fundamentally the weak link in the security chain. We have a lot of security problems in terms of the infrastructure, but even more in terms of the users, largely because they're not trained properly. And fundamentally, users really are the last line of defense. Virtually every organization out there, has some level of security infrastructure. They very often will have email filtering in the cloud to try to stop spam, malware, viruses, things that are fairly well known and that you can eliminate a lot of before they can actually ever reach the network. A lot of organizations have something at the gateway that will protect against, against all of these types of threats. They have something maybe at the server level. They'll have an end user solution at the endpoint, maybe antivirus software of some kind at the workstation. But then users really are that last line of defense. Because if you look at cloud security today, security at the gateway, server, workstation, and so forth, a lot of it is really very good, but something is going to get through. We're dealing with a very sophisticated enemy, and something eventually will get through to the end user. And as we've seen in statistics like the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, a lot of stuff does make its way all through these green boxes and does end up at the user. And so the user really is that last line of defense to protect the organization from being infected with malware, from launching a ransomware attack, and so forth. So a lot of problems really can be prevented. Preventing threats from being successful requires really a multifaceted approach to cybersecurity. You absolutely need stuff at the cloud, at the gateway, at the server, at the end user workstation level. But you also need good security awareness training to be an important component of your organization's security posture. And so one of the issues you have to deal with is, if you're going to be asked to implement security awareness training, is it going to be effective? Is it going to stop ransomware? Is it going to stop business email compromise? Is it going to stop users from clicking on phishing links or opening attachments? And what we found is in the research report that we did in April, in almost every category of threat protection about which we asked, organizations that focus more on security awareness training really do believe that the effectiveness of their defenses is superior. And it applies even to defenses that are not directly related to security awareness training. And what we found fundamentally across all of these different categories is that organizations that do frequent and effective security awareness training rate their security solutions as 42% higher than organizations that do infrequent or no security awareness training at all. So in terms of things like eliminating malware before it reaches end users or eliminating ransomware, what have you, for all of these categories, the organizations that really focus on security awareness training are much more satisfied with the security posture that they have across all of these different potential threat vectors. So in terms of best practices, there really are a number that you need to focus on. First and foremost, before you do any training, before you do implementation of any technology, establish good policies. Have good acceptable use policies for email, for social media, for all of the collaboration tools that you use, for any cloud-based applications or mobile applications that users are going to have access to. It's absolutely critical that you establish very sound policies so that users understand what they can and cannot do. Then you need to implement and or update your company procedures so that you understand what you're supposed to do in the event of an attack, what users are supposed to do when they receive information that might be suspicious, for example, an email or when they see a social media link with a short URL and so forth. You need to develop those best practices for user behavior, train your users, and really help them to understand what they should be doing and what they should not be doing. A lot of organizations today don't do that. They allow users to do pretty much anything they want, and while you don't want to stifle user behavior, you do want to develop best practices and train users so that they know what they're supposed to do, because a lot of this stuff isn't going to be obvious, particularly to casual users. You need to ensure that users are adequately trained. They need to understand what to do with a suspicious email, why not to click on a link in an email whose origin they're not sure of, and so forth. And then you need to understand that security awareness training really is an essential component of any security infrastructure. Now, it's not meant to replace any of your security infrastructure, but it will bolster what you have in place, and it's an absolutely essential component of anything you're doing from a security perspective. Okay, that concludes my part of the presentation. Here's our contact information, and at this point I'd like to turn it over to Eric. Eric, the floor is yours.
Great, I appreciate it. No, that's all very, very good information there. Absolutely, I agree with everything you said there, and there's a lot of good stats in there too. I'm going to talk a little bit here about how to make that training actually really work for you, right? Because there's security awareness training the old school way, and then there's the new stuff. And quite honestly, the old school way is not nearly as effective as doing it the new school way. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I thought it was very interesting, some of the numbers that you had there, some of the information that you put out. We see this all the time, and I see a lot of things when I speak publicly, and I'm at these conventions and talking to folks and hearing from the frontline practitioners. A lot of what you put up there is absolutely reflected by the real life people. So thanks for all of that. A little bit about myself first. Good looking guy on there. I've got a little bit more gray in my beard than it looks like there, but been in IT and security since about the mid-1990s. Like it was said earlier, I worked with the government a bit. I've been around the manufacturing side, and I was the security manager for the U.S. Army's 2nd Regional Cyber Center, Western Hemisphere, which is a pretty interesting role there. So that's kind of my background. I've got my CISSP and a whole bunch of alphabet soup after that as well. And then a little bit about our organization. KnowBe4, we're based out of Tampa, Florida. So our picture is a little bit closer to what it looks like right now than you up there in Seattle, Michael. It's a little bit brighter and sunnier out here, but we'll take it for now. We'll talk in the summertime when it's humid and hot. But essentially what we do is we help organizations deal with the problem of social engineering, which is what leads to all of these issues with CEO fraud or business email compromise. And we do that through security awareness training and a simulated phishing platform. This is very effective because, as you said, the employees are the last line of defense. Right now, what we're seeing is 91% of the successful data breaches start with a spearphishing attack, and that's pretty significant. The things that happen with that, obviously, we also have CEO fraud, the business email compromise we're talking about here, W-2 scams, the cousin of that, and then, of course, ransomware, which is a pretty big deal. Every time I'm at one of these deals where I'm talking to folks, ransomware is just a extremely hot topic with them. They know the pain that happens when they're infected with ransomware, and all of the things that go along with that. And it's almost always caused by a user clicking on a bad link. And some of the recent stats that we've seen on this is it's about 33 man-hours to recover from a ransomware attack. And that includes, the time of the person who is not actually doing anything because they're waiting for their computer to come back, and your IT folks. It can be compounded drastically if you don't have good backups in place. But ultimately, if the users would stop clicking on things, that's going to make your day a whole lot brighter, right? So how do you manage these threats? It's actually like 4 key things that you do here that we found is incredibly effective, right? First of all, you want to know where you're at. You want to train your users. You want to continue to phish your users so they remember and think a little bit about this. And then you want to watch the results and adjust as you move along too. we're going to get a little bit more into the details on this in a moment here, but for now, I want to cover that, comprehensive programs is what it takes to do this. This isn't the stuff your people in a room, feed them coffee and donuts, and think that if you do this once a year that your awareness program is going to be effective, because it's really not. Michael covered the issues and the facts around this threat landscape, and he even showed how organizations that do good security awareness training feel much better about their security posture, and that's very true. They feel this way because they see it in action, And a lot of organizations that don't do these comprehensive programs, unfortunately what's happening is they're not understanding how serious the threat is. The threat of these phishing attacks, we all just think, oh, it's a phishing email, whatever, we toss it. But they're extremely brutal on organizations when users click on these links. So not only do you need a comprehensive program and not one just for compliance, if you're just checking the box once a year, again, that's not going to do much for you. But it also needs to be coordinated. And I'll tell you, every time I see this picture, I think of that insurance commercial with the guy with the dollar bill on the end of the fishing pole. You got to be quicker than that. Anyways, that's what always comes to mind with here. But, really, these campaigns need to be coordinated. You need to put together a couple of things. You train them once a year, not going to help you. If you just do phishing of groups of employees, right? You don't train them on what to look for. A couple of things can happen there. First of all, people can get frustrated, especially those that are not great with technology already. We all have those kind of users that don't really like email or don't really like technology. They're really nervous and skittish around it. If all you're doing is throwing phishing emails at them without teaching them the tools to recognize them, it's very easy for them to get frustrated and get to the point where they're just like, I can't do this. It's just not going to happen. Whatever, I'll just click on whatever, and they give up, right? So it's important that you train them what to look for before you start, going out there and doing these repeated simulated phishing attacks. And if you put these things together, you can make a huge difference. And what this means is, set up your training and your phishing attacks to complement each other. So you teach everyone these things. You teach them what to look for in phishing emails. And phishing emails are like any con or scam. There's always going to be some sort of a tell there, and users need to be able to identify that. And the tells are usually something, very simple, like the reply to address is something weird. Did I get this message at 3 o'clock in the morning from my HR department on a Saturday when this never happens? These things make you kind of wonder something's a little bit off on this. So it's important to let them understand how to look for these things. And they don't have to be like super James Bond tech folks looking at headers and all of that stuff. They just have to be able to kind of spot that something's a little bit off on it. And that's where the training really does its thing. As a matter of fact, in our training, we have a resource that the users can do. It's like 22 different things to look at in an email that are possible red flags. And it doesn't take long to look at these things. Once you recognize them, you look at them a couple of times, it's very easy to spot the phishing emails using these 22 red flags. But then if you just kind of leave it behind there and you train them and don't do anything for a year, they're going to forget. They're going to get busy with other things. And that's where this other part, this simulated phishing of employees comes into play. And the idea there is you're going to be sending them these simulated phishing attacks, and they're going to be thinking, hey, are these emails, is this phishing email, or this one looks like a phishing email, is it one of the ones from our IT guys? And they're going to have their eyes open to that. They're going to be keeping an eye on that, and they're much more likely to identify them and or report them if you're doing that, because they're looking for them. If they don't get these simulated phishing attacks, then when the real phishing one comes in maybe 3-4 months after you've trained them, they're much more likely to click on it. So this is why it really improves the effectiveness of putting these two things together. Now, the 4 steps that I talked about, the first one is kind of a baseline phishing test, and we can do this for you free if it's not something you know how to do. The idea is you can't manage what you don't measure. So you got to kind of know where you're coming from with respect to your organization's current phish-prone percentage. In other words, the percentage of folks that click on emails. And I can tell you, real life and talking to people here, it's very common to see 20+% click rates. I've seen 30, 35%. I've actually even heard of some places where they started this and ended the test early because it was just off the charts how much the users were clicking. They're like, okay, that's enough. We know that it's just really bad. But it's important to understand just how bad it is and where you're coming from, right? If your users take this initial campaign and don't click on a whole lot of things, then you know that, okay, they've already got some sort of an idea of what's going on. And when you start doing your simulated phishing attacks, you can start them off a little bit tougher, which is something you don't want to do if your users are in a high click rate, because, again, you don't want them frustrated, putting their hands in the air and going, I'll never get this. You want them to experience some success by spotting some of these early on and reporting them, and positive reinforcement behind that, and then you make them a little bit tougher over time to keep testing them and improving their skills. But you don't want them getting so frustrated that they're just going to throw their hands up in the air and say, I can't do this. So it's important to know where you're coming from, right? And then with respect to the training, I hear a lot of questions about who should we train? Well, we're big advocates of all the way from the boardroom to the lunchroom. This includes all new employees. This includes your leadership, your C-suite. And Michael talked a little bit there about, getting good policies in your organization to help fight some of these things. And your policies, the teeth that your policies get are from your leadership being behind them, right? So if you have an organization that everyone and their brother wants to download executables and it's real open-ended there, you're going to have a lot of issues with malware. I've been there, I've done that. And if your leadership isn't aware of the threats that face the organization and the leadership themselves, getting strong policies that are going to drive these procedures can be very, very difficult. So that's why it's important to train everyone all the way from the top. And I mean, your C-suite is also a target, obviously, with the CEO fraud. They're going after CFOs and controllers and people in the leadership. And, they're also going after, though, the people like your receptionists up front. If they have an email address, they're susceptible to being phished and ultimately spreading ransomware, doing these sorts of things, forwarding emails that are phishing emails to people that they say, hey, I think maybe this is more like in your space. I've seen all of these things sort of happen. And when you train your people, too, the other thing is you need to understand that it helps to let them know the basic mechanisms of these different types of attacks. Now, again, they don't have to be pros on this, but they have to kind of understand what it means. What's a spearphishing attack, and why would somebody want to send these emails to me? And once they understand what they have to lose, it makes a big difference, and they can get on board with it easier. I mean, nobody really likes to be told, do this because I said so, right? So you teach them a little bit about it, they feel comfortable or more comfortable with it, and you'll see a great improvement in what's going on. The other thing I like to talk about is when you're training your people, your messaging is very, very important. You should never put up a wall of shame. That's one of those things that's kind of a big no-no unless you're in an organization that the culture is kind of understands this and has fun. Like here locally, we train our own people, or we phish our own people, and we've caught our own people, and we kind of do the walk of shame, but it's okay in our culture because we understand. Now, you never want to make somebody feel bad about it if they're in an organization where people are a little bit shy. You don't want them to feel like you're out to get them. And to help with that, some of your messaging, it's important to let them know that they're protecting themselves too. Have them have some skin in the game. So when you're talking about things like, the CEO fraud or business email compromise, or you're talking about things like the W-2 fraud especially, these are all things that impact the user. Can you imagine if the payroll account is diverted to a different bank account because of a CEO fraud and nobody gets paid for a little while they straighten that out? Or your W-2s get sent to the bad guys and now they've filed your taxes on your behalf. Or ransomware. I mean, these people, individuals are just as susceptible to ransomware at home as folks are in your business environment. So if you tell them, hey, we're training you to protect yourself against these things, which include having all of your photographs of your kids or grandkids or all of that encrypted where you're not going to get them back unless you pay a large sum of money, it really gets them on board with the training program. And then positive reinforcement. Man, great job catching that. And as you make things tougher, as you move on and they get better, you approach it with the idea that, you're going to tell them, hey, you guys are doing such a great job. We in the IT department are going to have to step up our game a little bit here. And we're going to have to really work a little bit harder to get you guys. Let's see if we can do this, okay? And that positive messaging will make a huge difference in how your users deal with this training and how effective it can be. And then when you're phishing them, you want to get to where you're phishing them like the bad guys. I mean, this is ultimately what you're trying to do, is prevent them from clicking on the things that the bad guys are sending. So you want to send them, if at all possible, a random email at a random time to random users. That way they're not popping up and going, hey, Bob, don't click on that Amazon one. That's a phishing email or simulated phishing email from the IT guys. Because your idea here is you're testing the user's ability to spot these, not communicate through the cube walls. So you want to kind of mix it up a little bit there and make it random. The other thing you want to do is make it personalized. Add their name. Use their boss's name. Say something like, hey, your boss Bob said that you can help me by sending me this information or by checking out this link. Do that sort of thing, because the bad guys can do that, getting information from LinkedIn or a myriad of other resources to figure out your org chart there. And you want to kind of mimic that behavior, right? Also, when you do some attachments in there, if you're going to do attachments to have them click, make it enticing. Make it, Q4 payroll. Make it 2017 bonuses or, Q3 layoffs or something that's going to make them want to click, because that's exactly what's happening. And you need to make sure that people realize that just because an email isn't riddled with typos like the old Nigerian print scams are, that doesn't mean it's safe either. And then finally, you want to continue to test them. You want to keep looking at this, analyze the data, take a look at, are they clicking on these things? And if you get down to where you're not getting anybody on these, or you start getting down in the low single percents, you want to you really want to ratchet it up a little bit, make it a little bit tougher for them, because that's how you're going to protect them, right? Make it a little tougher. Again, positive reinforcement is key here. We're not out to get them. We're out to teach them good behavior. And, how effective is this stuff? Well, Michael already talked about a bit of that. But, Forrester, we'd had a TEI study done from Forrester. And the payback for what we do is less than a month with 127% ROI. That's pretty significant. That's how effective security awareness training can be for the cost. And then in addition, this chart that I just put up, this is 300,000 of our users from over 250 companies, and they were aggregated together for a year time frame. And initially, these 300,000 users, the average click rate was about 16%. Okay, and then you can see that as they train them, it drops down pretty good. Now, if you stop at that training period, what's going to happen is it's going to end up looking like a U or a V. It's going to go right back up because they're no longer thinking about this all the time. But by reinforcing that training with the simulated phishing attacks over time, you see the number continues to drop. And then at the end of a year, they're down to 1.2%. And so that's a 93% reduction in click rates over 300,000 people. And what this means for you is a huge savings in your time and effort running around dealing with malware, dealing with these sorts of threats, right? And a huge risk reduction. Talked to one of our customers who he was just thrilled to have us. He said that they were initially spending about 40 hours per month dealing with malware instances in their organization, different infections, cleaning this, cleaning that. It came out to about 40 hours a month. When they trained their people and started doing this phishing stuff like this, they dropped it down to about 3 hours per month total that they're spending dealing with malware infections, because people just aren't clicking the links anymore. And this allows them to now focus on getting ahead of the problem. Instead of being firefighters all the time, they're able to work on some of the more strategic projects, not just re-imaging machines. So in the real world, I mean, this is definitely something that that has positive results for folks, and quite honestly can take a little bit of the gray hair out of your job. Hopefully let you keep your color a little bit longer. So that being said, I mean, that's my tips and tricks on how to make a more effective security awareness program. And, I thank you for your time here. I'm going to turn it back over to Michael because I think we have some audience questions here. Michael?
Yes, Eric, thank you very much. Great presentation and great content. Thank you for the tips on that you provided on training. We do have some questions that have come in, and we would like to encourage you to ask as many as we'll have time for. First question, how can we educate C-levels who are too busy for training about these threats? How do we get them to care about educating not only themselves but also their users?
Yeah, so, it is always a trick to get the C-suite up there involved. But I think as we see more and more of these attacks, and as they're making the headlines and they're being seen in the areas which they read, they're becoming more open to some of this. Now, I've found and heard folks say that if they start putting out some sort of a newsletter, maybe weekly or bi-weekly, something like that, where they mention some of these threats or organizations similar to theirs that have been hit, that helps the C-level start. It plants that seed in their mind that, hey, maybe we ought to think about this. And then when you train the C-suite, no doubt a lot of times these guys are very, very busy, guys and gals. They may not have enough time to go through, say, a 45-minute or something like that training. It's important that you get them at least, like a 15-minute training, something to let them know the threats that are out there. They may not be as in-depth as the other folks because, they are running a company, but at least get them aware of that. And again, that kind of ties back to getting your policies and procedures in place by letting them know about the threat that's out there. For that reason, we actually offer 3 different lengths of our basic training there, which is a 15-minute, a 25-minute, and a 45-minute version. And it'd be great if you can get your C-suite to go through all 45 minutes. It will definitely benefit them, but we understand that sometimes you just need to hit the hot topics very hard there in the 15-minute.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Yeah, one of the things we found in our research is that, organizations and decision makers, in general, tend not to be very proactive. If you're talking to a CFO who has just gotten hit with a $10 million BEC attack and they've wired the money out, they're going to be a pretty receptive audience. But until that happens, they tend not to be too proactive, unfortunately. Very true. Another question. How often should we send phishing emails to our users?
If we had it my way, it'd be hourly, but that may be a little excessive, all right? What we found here is if you do it at least monthly, you're going to see the kind of results that, that we were showing here. If you can do it twice a month, that's even better. Some cultures, some organizations may not like that so much, so you got to kind of feel that a little bit. But ultimately, at least once a month, you need to be sending out these simulated phishing attack reminders. After that, people tend to start to kind of forget a little bit, and they start paying attention to other things.
Mm-hmm. Question for me, do you find that some industries or some types of organizations are more receptive to more frequent phishing email tests?
I don't know that it's necessarily different types of organizations. I think it has more to do with company culture. I mean, you can have 2 different companies that are in the same business and have completely different company culture. And it also has a lot to do with your messaging when you go to set these things up. So again, there's so much relies on the messaging. When you go into this and you're going, all right, guys, we're going to make you safer here and at home, people tend not to mind getting those emails, and they feel good about, I spotted one of yours, as opposed to, hey, we're just trying to sucker you into clicking on this thing, which is generally not as well received.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question: should we have different awareness training lessons for different employees or departments in the organization?
I would say in that case, yes and no. So I say that because everybody needs to have the basic core knowledge. Everybody is susceptible to these different things. They need to know about connecting to Wi-Fi hotspots, because how many people check their work email on their cell phones when they're at Starbucks or whatever, So everybody needs to be aware of those, but you do need to spend some focus on folks that are dealing with specific threats. For example, people that deal with credit card data. You want to give a little bit of maybe a PCI-ish or PCI-focused course to them. Let them know about the things that kind of impact that. If you have groups that are dealing with protected health information or PHI, maybe some HIPAA-focused or PHI, protecting personal information sort of stuff should go to them, or in accounting, the different groups that may be impacted by different things and different targets, you should go a little bit further, maybe give them some micro modules or a little bit of focused areas on that. But ultimately, the baseline needs to be the same.
Okay, very good. Another question just came in. How effective is email filtering against today's threats? And I assume they're talking about phishing, spearphishing, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so, email filtering, it's one of the layers that you have to have, and it's kind of like antivirus or endpoint protection. It's not something that you're going to throw out at this point in time. You need to have it, and what it does is it's part of that risk reduction thing. Every layer reduces the risk a little bit. Now, when it comes to phishing attacks, bulk phishing attacks, they can be somewhat effective. Once it's known that these are phishing attacks, those reputation engines, those sorts of things can shut them down at the gateway. But when it comes to the really spear phishing, very, whaling, very focused attacks, they're just not very effective. And it's hard to imagine a case where the software can tell the difference between a true email from your CEO or to your CEO from a good guy and a bad guy. There just aren't enough ways to do that electronically. So, ultimately what they're going to do is they're going to reduce a lot of the noise, but the truly targeted stuff is still going to make it right through to your users.
Mm-hmm. Well, and a case in point, and you touched on this earlier with social media. I wrote a blog post a while back, and was talking about how people overshare so much in social media, and they do so to an extent that you can gather that information, even if you're not friends with them. Let's say on Facebook, you can gather that information and craft a spearphishing message that's going to be fairly effective. They'll post that they went to such and such a restaurant 3 days ago. You can send them an email with a subject line, problem with your credit card charge at such and such a restaurant. That's the kind of message they're likely to open because it's relevant to their recent experience, and they can click on a link and infect themselves. So yeah, you're right. We're not going to get defenses against that kind of threat very readily because it's so easy to get through.
Mm-hmm.
Another question just came in. Are there any AI programs that can detect threats in the field?
Oh, boy. Machine learning and AI is such to me, it's a very fascinating topic, and it's developing very quickly. I know they're trying to leverage some of that, especially in the endpoint protection piece. Really what I've seen, and in my personal experience, the reputation side, the reputational engines are doing the bulk of things right now. In other words, somebody gets infected and then the information gets back to the vendors that they can then block, suspicious or infected hosts. the command and control channels for things, all of that. But usually in those cases, somebody has to be infected first before things happen. Now, with respect to AI, and heuristics, if you look at the stats on, say, endpoint protection and being able to spot certain things heuristically, the numbers just aren't there yet. Perhaps they'll get better in the future, but I'm not holding my breath on that. But when you're looking at, behavioral type analysis and things like that, I think we still have a long ways to go on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Another question, is there an ideal type of company or company size that would be best suited to security awareness training? And, I would add to that, a lot of small companies think that they're not susceptible to bad guys because they're off the radar. So, is there an ideal type of company that people should focus on?
Honestly, no. And this is something I hear too when I'm out talking and dealing with folks, is that they don't think they're a threat, right? Or they don't think that they're a target. What information do I have? We're just a small business. Well, if you look at some of the numbers here on like the W-2 fraud stuff this year, businesses as small as 7 people have been hit with W-2 fraud. They sent out the information to the bad guys, and now these 7 employees have to jump through all kinds of hoops in the future. They've had their income tax filings done already. So no, there is no too small to do this sort of thing. There really isn't. And likewise, there's really no too big. Everybody needs to kind of be aware of this. And especially on the smaller side, like we deal a lot in the SMB here in KnowBe4. Those folks a lot of times are wearing a lot of different hats, right? So these poor security guys are running around, or IT/security / compliance, those poor guys are running around changing the hats all day long. It can be very difficult for them to keep up the defenses that they need to do and do it all, where some of these larger enterprise groups that have like a security team can sometimes fend off a little bit better or have a little bit better way to defend against this. So I actually think the SMBs are more susceptible than the enterprises.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, that's all the time we have questions for. Eric, thank you very much for your presentation and the great answers to these questions. We did announce that we were going to have a random drawing for 3 $100 Amazon.com gift certificates. We've selected those winners. They are Raja Shekhar, Vijay Havaralu, and Chris Freeman. Congratulations, and we will be getting back to you very shortly to find out where you'd like us to send those. Eric, once again, thank you, and Bob, I'd like to turn the floor back to you now.
Okay, thank you very much. On behalf of Osterman Research, I want to thank both Michael and Eric, and we want to thank KnowBe4 for making today's event possible. Recording of today's presentation will be available shortly, so watch your emails for this notice, and this concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for attending, and you may now disconnect.